Hello everyone. So today I am going to be talking about some brand new bronzers to the marketplace. So what I have here are two shades of the new Armani bronzer, which is available just on the Nordstrom website. And then I also have two shades of the new YSL bronzers, which are currently available just on the Nordstrom website, but which should be coming to Sephora any day now. And then I also have the shade Beachwalk Betty in the new RMS Bronzer, and I was so impressed with this particular product that I ordered all three of the other shades from the RMS website, and so I should be receiving those soon. So I thought that what I would do in the meantime is just talk about the products that I do have and compare them to one another, and then when I get in the other shades of this, then we can focus more on that in another video. So first, a little bit of information about me. I'm 59 years old and I have dry and very sensitive skin, and over the past 3 years I've tried more than 1,000 makeup products, and so I do have a pretty good basis of comparison for everything that I try. And one thing that I have found out is that there are certain ingredients that always do irritate my skin, and these are ingredients that many other people say are irritating for them as well, so I just don't talk about any products with those ingredients on this channel. Now, when I first started to look into the concept of bronzers a few years ago, when I started to get back into looking at makeup again, I found myself really confused by the whole topic. And I think that the reason for that is because different people are using different kinds of bronzers in different ways. And so therefore, it was hard for me to figure out exactly what kind of bronzers to choose and how I should use them. So I thought that I would talk just briefly about some different ways that people can use bronzers, or that I have used bronzers, and what kinds of bronzers might be appropriate for that. So the first way that I often use bronzers is by trying to really just darken my skin in general. So I try really hard to stay out of the sun and to not have my skin get tan at all. And that is probably a good strategy, I think, but it is the case also that, especially when it gets to be the middle of summer, I feel myself looking quite pale. And so my goal then is to really just give myself a look, not of necessarily having my face be sculpted, but just to have my face be a little bit more tan and a little bit what people consider to be healthier looking. And so for that, what I am looking to do is to put a little bit of bronzer like all over my face in a fairly light layer. So I'm focusing a little bit more certainly on my cheekbones and on the top half of my face, but I also am trying to make a little bit of a color on my whole face in general, just so that I look a little bit more naturally tanned. And so I think this idea of darkening your face, I think this is going to be something that's going to be really attractive to people who are on the pale side. I think that if you have darker skin, then you may not need or want to be doing that. But for someone like me, this can be a good way to use bronzer. And if you're going to use bronzer like that, then I think it's probably a good idea to choose one that is reasonably matte. Now, that doesn't mean that it can't have a little tiny bit of a shimmer in it, but you don't want it to be too shimmery, because then it's going to really either look really fake or it's going to look like you're sweating, and neither one of those is exactly what I'm trying to get when I'm just trying to make myself look a little bit darker. So if I get naturally tan, I think that my skin might get a tiny bit more golden than it is when I'm totally haven't gotten any sun at all. But for the most part, my skin really just stays the same undertone. It just gets a bit darker. So I think that it's really important that if I choose a bronzer that is going to be darkening my skin in general, then it really needs to be close to my own undertone, but just a little bit more saturated with color. So for instance, for me, what I think is the case with my skin is that it has a fair amount of both pink and yellow in it. And so it comes across as looking kind of peach. And I do think it's the case that when I have gotten tanned, and it's been a while since I've gotten very tan, but that my skin does get kind of more of a peachy color to it. And I do think that when I have used various different colors of bronzers, that some of the ones that have worked the best for me do have that kind of a peach color to them. And even though peach is supposed to be neutral when people describe makeup, in a lot of cases when I have picked out bronzers, if they haven't had that peachiness to them and they have looked two kind of like just brown neutral type colors, then that tends to look a little bit muddy on me. So I am a little bit wary about the idea of a bronzer that just says neutral on it, because a lot of times those don't really look like my natural skin tone. And then I think that for some people that have very pink skin, that using a bronzer that goes more on the pink side might be a good idea. And if people have more yellowish type skin, then choosing a bronzer that's more golden and a little bit darker than their skin tone, that might work also. So it used to be much more difficult to try to find the right bronzer that would match my undertone or other people's undertones, because in the past, most companies were really only selling a few bronzers, or certainly they weren't selling more than one or two bronzers for each particular skin tone. So the bronzers that might have been available from one company, most of them were really too dark for me. But I think that things have really changed over the past couple of years, and now there are a number of companies that are selling a number of different bronzers in terms of the undertones, and so you might be able to find one that's more appropriate for you. In some cases, there are companies that are selling a dozen different bronzers, like House Labs, and in theory that should be helpful. And insofar as you can go to a store like Sephora and swatch all those shades, then that might be even more helpful in letting you figure out which ones might be most appropriate for you. Now, the second way that I think is quite different to use a bronzer is to use it sort of as you would use a blush or a highlighter, and to use it primarily on the cheekbones, or maybe a little bit over the bridge of the nose, maybe keeping it up fairly high, so that you're giving some definition to your face, or what is called sculpting, but doing it in a way that you might use blush. And I think that for this kind of bronzer, that you don't necessarily need to have a bronzer that's exactly matching your undertone, and that you might be able to do well with the bronzer that's a bit of a different color. So for instance, I think in a lot of cases, a bronzer that's more reddish or that's more pinkish might work really well for that. If it still has a lot of brown in it or tans, then it might still qualify as looking like a bronzer, but I think that in that case it might be not necessarily need to match your undertones so much. And I think that for me, I certainly have found a number of bronzers that do have that ruddy type of a quality to them that I think look nice, and they sort of give a semi-sunburned look that is not unappealing, especially in the middle of summer. I think it is kind of pretty. And then the other thing that you might want to do if you're using a bronzer like this is to have a bronzer that has a noticeable amount of shimmer in it, or that has a sort of a noticeable amount of a glassiness to it. And so in that case, then again, you're using it more like you would a highlighter, but it's sort of a bronzy highlighter. And so, of course, regardless of what kind of skin tone you have, even if you have very dark skin, then you may find a bronzer like that to be very helpful. But I think that for me, I tend to use the more matte type bronzers as an overall darkening my face, and then I tend to use the sculpting type of bronzers with the more color or more shimmer just on top of my cheekbones. And I usually these days will use both of those to create one look. So it seems kind of obvious at this point that that's a good idea and that it's working well for me. But the person that I first learned about this concept from was actually Gucci Westman. So she is from Westman Atelier, which is a company that sells quite expensive makeup. And so she did a series of videos on YouTube where she talked about her concept of bronzing. So what she said was that she would use a powder bronzer like this one, which unfortunately comes in this really expensive case. And she would use this with a brush all over the face just to kind of warm things up. And then after that, then she would put one of her highlighting type bronzers on the top of it. So one that I actually like a lot is this one, which is the lit up stick. And this is the shade Brulee, which is both a glassy type of a highlighter with a good bit of reddishness to it. And I think that that is really pretty on my cheeks. And then she also makes in the super loaded tinted highlighter line a shade that is called Poda Soleil, and so this one also has some bronziness to it. And I really like both of these products very much, and the powder bronzer is fine also, and it's actually a pretty good color for me. But these are quite expensive, so I'm not necessarily suggesting that this is the one that everyone should buy. But I think that this concept of layering it and of darkening the skin, if you want your skin to be darkened, first, and then adding some highlight over the top of it, either reddishness or shimmeriness or both, it creates a really pretty look, at least in my opinion. So another way that people sometimes use bronzer is as a contour. So if you're doing contouring, and especially if you have skin that is my skin tone, then I don't know that something that's labeled as a bronzer might be the best idea, because I think that if you're going to put a bronzer like in this part of your cheek, that you might want it to be a little bit less warm and a little bit more gray colored. And yet, when I looked, for instance, on the House Labs website, there was a video of Lady Gaga, who was putting on what she said was contour, but she was using shade number 4 of the bronzers from House Labs, which is very similar to this shade. So it's definitely a peachy brownish type of a shade with maybe a little bit of reddishness to it. But I don't really see any gray in this one, and I don't think that shade number 4 has any gray in it. And she did not seem to be looking like there was gray in there, but she was still putting this bronzer like on her cheekbones and then carrying it down. And that isn't necessarily how I would do my makeup, and I don't usually use contour anyway. But I think that there's a lot of things that Lady Gaga does with her makeup that are not the things that I would do. And yet I think that her products from the House Labs line are all really good quality products pretty much across the board. So in any case, I think that sometimes when people are using bronzers, they are using them for contouring, and so that is another thing to keep aware of. And when that's the case, then a lot of times people will go more on the cool or gray side, and that bronzers are considered to be a little bit more on the yellowish or red side. Now, one way that I do use bronzers routinely for contouring, quote unquote, is that I will take, whenever I put on bronzer, I will take some of it and just put it on my neck. Because first of all, my neck does tend to be pretty white, and also because I think that I'm kind of motivated, because I don't want there to the slackness here or wrinkles or whatever. I kind of don't want those to be protruding forward. So if I just darken it, then that draws less attention to this whole area down here. So I will just put a little bit of a bronzer on there. Now, I guess in theory, I could use a contour. Maybe that would make it even more realistic. But I think that my neck down here is already getting some shadows, so you're already getting a little bit of the grayness to it. And I think it also is the case that it looks fine, and I don't think it needs to be more gray. But in any case, I think that that is a good thing to do with bronzer, and that is something I do really routinely. So with all that being the case, when I look at a bronzer, what I'm trying to do is to decide what the real purpose of that is. Because if it's a shimmery bronzer, then I'm certainly not going to want to be using it all over my face to darken my face. And if it's too reddish, then I certainly don't want to be using it all over my face, because then I will just be, at best, looking like I have a sunburn. And then if a bronzer is just a matte tone, then I could use it as a highlighting type bronzer. But I think that's a little bit of too much of a matte look. I'm looking, especially in the summer, for something that looks a little bit more hydrated and a little bit more glowy. So let me say first that when we look at both the Armani bronzers and the YSL bronzers, I would say that both of these count as the kind of bronzers that I would be inclined to use all over my face. So even though these have a tiny little bit of shimmer in them, it's such a small amount and it is such small particles that I don't think it's going to look unattractive even if I use it on my face in general. Then it might look a little tiny bit dewy, but it's not going to look like I'm sweating, and it's not going to look like it's artificial artificial or that I've just got highlighter all over my face. So I think that both of these work pretty well for that. And then this is what the YSL one looks like. And again, it says on the website that this has a little bit of a shimmer to it, but it's such a small amount. In fact, when I look at it on the pan or swatched on my hand, I'm really not seeing any shimmer at all in this one. And so that for that reason, I think that this is actually a really good bronzer to consider if the goal is to create a overall darkened look on the skin. And I do think that both of these bronzers are designed to be really close to being what people's actual skin tones look like, or what their skin tones might look like if they were a little bit more tan. And so again, I think that they're quite well designed for the purpose of just darkening the skin a little bit. Now, on the other hand, when I look at this RMS bronzer, this seems quite different to me. So even in the pan, it's noticeably more shimmery than the other two bronzers. And when I put it on my hand, I can see that it's much more shimmery. And certainly when I put it on my face, when I've experimented with it in different ways, it definitely does seem to be the case that if I start to use too much of this, especially on areas like my forehead or and other parts of my face, that it does start to look overwhelming really fast. So I think that this is best thought of as what I would consider to be a highlighting bronzer or a blush type of a bronzer that is bringing color to the cheeks and mostly in this area here, and that being careful to not use too much of it or maybe even any of it in other parts of the face might be a good idea. And so that is how I used it today. What I did today is to use the other bronzers, both the YSL one and the Armani one, to darken my skin a little bit, and then after that I put on a good bit of this bronzer, just more like a blush. And then I just put on a tiny little bit of a peach type blush over the top of that just to give it a little bit more of an obvious pop of color. So that is why I decided to buy all of the shades of this particular product, because when I realized that it was working well for me as a blush and a highlighter type of a bronzer, then my hope is that I might be able to use some of the other shades in that same way. And it looks like they might give a slightly different look, so I'm a little bit curious about what that different look might be. But on the other hand, with this Armani bronzer or the YSL bronzer, I don't think that I would want to get the bronzer shades that are darker, because I think that there is no way that I would be able to use those on my skin tone. So if you haven't already guessed, I do think that these new bronzers are very, very similar to the existing RMS blush. And that is a great thing for me, because that is really my favorite blush formula, and I feel really happy every time I use this blush. So what we have here, this is the new bronzer in the shade Beachwalk Betty, and then this is the existing blush shade in the shade Crystal Slipper. And I think that Crystal Slipper, when I put this on my face, it does look an awfully lot like a bronzer to begin with. It just has a little bit of pinkishness to it. And so I think that this new bronzer of theirs is just one more small step towards being a bit more neutral and a little bit less pink, but it still really is in the same basic concept. And so what I swatched on my hand, at the top here we have the Beachwalk Betty shade, then we have a shade that's called Maiden's Blush, and then we have the shade Crystal Slipper, and then at the bottom we have a shade that's called Bohemian Girl, which is considerably more peach. And I don't think that any of these are really different from one another in terms of the amount of shimmer. It's basically exactly the same formula. There might be a little bit of a difference in terms of the order of a couple of the ingredients. But overall, it performs really exactly the same to me. It looks the same in terms of the amount of shimmer and the really beautiful formula of these. They're very moisturizing. They have a lot of really nice oils in them, and I think that they look really pretty on the skin. So this is what I think is often called a baked gelée formula, and it's made in Italy, and it is not really a powder. It is a gel that is pressed into this compact, but that performs like a powder when you put it on your brush. But you don't necessarily have to apply it with the brush. You can just use a little bit of it on your fingers, and that goes on really nicely also. So I think that that's one characteristic that I have started to look for in a blush, the ability to do this. I think the House Labs blushes are able to do that, but not so much a lot of the others that are on the market. And there's a lot of really nice oils in this. There's some buriti oil and some other really lovely oils, and I think that that really helps it to kind of melt into the skin and to give it kind of a glowy look, even though we're talking about powder blush. Now, in terms of the color, I don't think it's entirely surprising to me that Rosemary Swift from RMS would have added a bit of reddishness to it, because for a long time she has had a product that's like a cream bronzer, and that one also has quite a bit of reddishness to it. So what we have here on the top, we have Beachwalk Betty in the new bronzer, and then on the bottom we have a cream product that is called the Buriti Bronzer. And although the Buriti Bronzer is quite a bit darker, I think, than the Beachwalk Betty shade, they are basically, I think, in the same color family. They both have a bit of that reddishness to them, but they also have a little bit of a gray and a little bit of brown. And overall, I think that these are shades that are really easy to wear and that can be used as basically highlighting really anywhere on the face. So for this Buriti bronzer, I just have it in this little palette from RMS right at the moment. And this one here is the Buriti bronzer shade. And when I first looked at that, I thought, wow, that is really dark. I would never use that as a blush. It's not really meant for me. But it actually has been a really terrific blush for me. And I also have periodically used it on my eyes, and I think it's been really nice for my eyes. And then another product that RMS has been making for years is what is called the luminizing powder, and what she has is in one shade is what is called the Madeira bronzer. So I will show you that. So what we have on the top is the new bronzer in Beachwalk Betty, then we have the Buriti bronzer, and then at the bottom we have the Madeira bronzer. And that comes in this huge container, and I think it is still available on the RMS website, but I would not be surprised if they were to phase this out now that they have released their new bronzers. This is a kind of an old-fashioned formula. It's just the kind of formula that would break into a million pieces if you did drop it on the floor. Now, I have found with this particular color is that it's a little bit dark for me. I think to use it a powder as a bronzer, I have to be really careful with it. But I feel like this has been a really terrific shade for my eyes, and it's been very gentle. It hasn't irritated my eyes at all, and I think it's really pretty. Now, it is kind of ridiculous to take out a container that is this large and just use this shade to put on your eyes. And so I'd always been kind of hoping that they would come out with like an eyeshadow palette that had this in it, but they haven't done that yet. Now, that being the case, when I first got this bronzer, one of the first things I did was to put this on my eyes. And I actually think it was super pretty on my eyes, and I was able to put it on with my fingers in like 2 seconds, so it was a really quick eyeshadow look. And I really liked it a lot, but I do think that this irritated my eyes. And I do have very sensitive eyelids, and this has a red pigment in it. I think it's red pigment number 30. And you're not really supposed to use red pigments on your eyes, I think, according to the FDA. And that is consistent with my experience that it does irritate my eyes. However, based on the information that I saw on the website, 2 of the shades of this actually don't include any red number 30 or any red food coloring at all in it. So I feel like with those other shades that I might have a good chance of using that on my eyelids. And I would really like that, because I think that this is a compact that I don't mind using on my eyes. This is not too large and too annoying to have around. And so I feel like even if I can't use those other shades on my cheeks, that they do have some potential to be used as eyeshadows. So let's talk about the 4 shades of the RMS Bronzer and what they are saying about them and what I've been able to gather by looking at the photographs. So the first one is Beachwalk Betty, which is the one that I have. They are calling that a sweet kiss of sun with neutral nude undertones and saying that it is mostly for fair to light complexions. I'm not sure why they are saying that that is neutral, because I think that it does lean decidedly toward the reddish side. But I do think that it can be worn by most people if you're using it as a sort of a blush bronzer, because it does have that reddishness to it. And then Malibu Muse, they are saying that that is a golden hour glow with warm amber undertones, and they're suggesting that for light to medium skin tones. And so clearly that one is not supposed to have that as much of that reddishness in it, but how yellow it leans, that's a little bit unclear from this. So this is one reason that I want to pick this up, because it could be that it's really just more peach. And then tan lines, it says it's an endless summer tan with neutral undertones for medium skin tones. And Rosemary Swift, when she was on QVC, she was talking about the idea that this is what she calls a real true tan color, and that there's a little bit of olive in it. And I think that that's very interesting. So I would be interested in taking a look at that, but it does look like it's more of a straight brown without a lot of yellowish or a lot of peachiness in it, from what I can tell in the photographs. And then Bikini Beach is supposed to be leaning, again, distinctly reddish. And it says that it is a deep bronze with a slight terracotta base for medium to deep skin tones. But Rosemary Swift said that it is supposed to be considerably more reddish, and so I am guessing that that is going to be like some of the previous bronzers that they have released. So I would say that as a bronzer that is serving for me as a sculpting and highlighting and blush type of a bronzer, this one really hits all the marks for me. So I really, really like this formula. I think this is absolutely superb. I think that the price is good. I really like this packaging, both because I think that it's simple and it doesn't take up too much room, and it's also refillable, so I think that is nice, and I don't think it's as environmentally problematic as some of the other types of containers that are on the market. And in general, I think this is just looks lovely on my skin and has been a joy to work with. So what I really feel like is that they have taken my favorite blush formula and they have extended the shades so that now there's some more neutral ones that I can use in the same way. And I think that part of the reason that I like it so much is because Rosemary Swift is in her late 60s, and so she's creating products that are not necessarily for 18-year-olds and that are really going to work for people of a variety of ages, including people who are getting older. And so it looks really appropriate, and it looks pretty, and it does add some life to my face. And I think all of those things are really terrific. So now let's talk about the YSL bronzers. So these are made in France, and it says on the Nordstrom website that they are supposed to be soft with a subtle shimmer, and they come in this packaging, which is quite reminiscent of this eyeshadow packaging. And these YSL eyeshadows, these are among my very favorite eyeshadows, maybe my most favorite. And I really like the formula for these eyeshadows. I think these are really outstanding in terms of how they appear to be a powder, but they're actually very soft. They're something that I could put on with my fingers. And they're really kind of leaps and bounds above pretty much all of the other eyeshadows that I have tried. So I had really high hopes for these bronzers, even though they did have talc in them. I was hoping that they would be a similar formula to those eyeshadows, and so that was a bit of a disappointment because that actually turned out not to be the case. So although these bronzers do have a little bit of some quality oils in them, apparently, I really feel like in terms of the formula, it's really performing like a basic powder formula with talc in it. And I don't necessarily think that having talc in this is a problem, but I also feel like in terms of the performance, I'm able to get a nice bronzed look from it, but I don't feel like it's the really lovely formula that I'm getting from either those eyeshadow palettes from YSL or from the RMS Bronzers, or from the House Labs Bronzers, that this is just more of a basic type of a formula. Now, I do think that it's finely ground, and so it is really goes on my skin and it sinks into my skin pretty easily, and it looks really natural. And probably that's the most important thing in a bronzer like this. But in terms of it being one of the really sophisticated modern type of formulas, I don't feel like that's what this is getting at all. I think that a lot of people really like the packaging for these. A lot of people really do talk about the fact that this seems like a YSL purse. And I actually am not a big fan of this packaging. I feel like it's kind of unnecessary, and it's probably adding a lot to the cost of the product. And I also think that probably this is making it less environmentally sustainable, and it's certainly not refillable. So I'm much more of a fan of the kind of packaging that RMS is doing than I am of this packaging. So there are 5 shades in this bronzer, and I think that the real standout characteristic for this particular bronzer line is that their first shade is a very, very pale shade that may allow people that are very light-skinned and who have found that the bronzers that they have tried in the past have been too saturated for them and have been given them more bronzing than they want, that it might make it very easy for them to add just a tiny little bit of a touch of bronzing to their skin. So I will show you the shade here. So this is the shade of the YSL bronzer. And then when I looked at that, I thought that it was a little bit odd how yellow it looked. And what it reminded me of was the Merit bronzer in the lightest shade, which is called Quince. So I swatched that here, but actually when you put this on your skin and then you blend it in, it goes very, very light, very fast. It's a really sheer bronzer. And I think that when you do that, it gets very close to this shade down here. So I think it's a little bit odd for the people that are making these really light bronzer shades to be making them so yellow, because I always felt like the people that have really, really light skin, that tends to be more likely to have a pink undertone to it, or maybe a neutral undertone. But I think it also could be, at least for me, that when my skin is very pale, that it does have a pink undertone, and then if I get a little bit of sun, that it tends to go a little bit more yellow. And so therefore it might actually be the case that for at least a lot of people, that maybe this would be sort of duplicating what would happen when they actually did get suntanned. And for me, even though usually I don't feel like I do all that well with bronzers if they do have a notable amount of yellow in them, I feel like with both of these bronzers that I've been able to put them on and they look fine. Now they do really disappear into my skin, and I'm not sure that they're really darkening my skin very much at all. But I have a skin tone that's not as light as some people. I'm more sort of naturally on the border between what's often described as fair versus light in foundation tones. So I think it could be worth it for people that have skin tones that are lighter than mine to give one of these bronzers a try, either this one by Merit or this one by YSL. And I do think that if you take a look at the Merit Quince bronzer and you give that a try and see how that looks on you, then that might give you a good sense of whether or not this YSL light color bronzer would work for you also, because I do think that both the undertones are very similar and that the amount of coloring that they're giving are very similar. So before I got this YSL bronzer, I thought that the lightest shade that I had in my powder bronze collection was the one that was from NARS in their lightest shade, so I did compare those two to one another, and I think that the YSL one is considerably lighter. And then the second color in the line is one that I think is sort of a standard peachy type of a color. It has a tiny bit of reddishness in it. And I think that this one has worked okay for my skin. Whether or not it's the ideal bronzer in my whole collection, I'm not so sure. I think that it will be easier to find that out when I swatch a lot of bronzers next to one another. And I think that this one might work for a lot of people with more neutral skin tones, though. And it is considerably darker. So when I use this on my skin in general, then I do think it gives me a noticeable amount of bronzing without my having to use a whole lot of it. So a lot of people have access to trying the Haus Labs bronzers because they can go to Sephora and swatch the colors in the store. So therefore I took one of the Haus Labs bronzers, the one that's supposed to be the lightest color that's neutral, and I swatched that in comparison to all of these other bronzers that I am demonstrating for you, so you can see how they all compare. And I do think that the Haus Labs bronzer in shade number 3, which is what I have here, and the YSL bronzer in shade number 2, that they're pretty close to one another. So those are both bronzers that I feel like I can use fairly interchangeably and that I can use all over my face and that they look reasonably okay. So I'm not sure if this YSL bronzer is going to be available in all of the Sephora stores, but if you want to see what the color for number 2 looks like, then if you take a look at the Haus Labs bronzer in number 3, then you can probably get a better sense of what you're going to be getting if you do choose that bronzer. And then in the other 3 shades of the YSL line, the third one is called Golden Medina, and I think that that one seems to be clearly meant for people that have considerably more yellow skin tones. So if you're looking for a bronzer that leans more golden, then that would be a good one for you. And then, of course, number 4 and number 5 are meant for darker skin tones. Now, in terms of the formula for these bronzers, it does have niacinamide in it and sodium hyaluronate in it, and that is why I was thinking that this would be more of like a softer formula that maybe I could put on with my fingers, but that does not seem to be the case at all. Now, unlike the RMS bronzer, it does not have any red coloring in it, and so I do think that I can put this on my eyes, and it hasn't caused irritation to my eyes, and it hasn't caused irritation to my face. Obviously, it's been perfectly fine, but I do think that it's really not that much fun to use as an eyeshadow. So the reason that I would be inclined to use that RMS bronzer as an eyeshadow is because it goes on so nicely and it blends in so nicely. And this is more like a standard eyeshadow that I would buy in a not too advanced eyeshadow palette, and so I'm a little bit not so interested in using these bronzers in that way. But you could. So as I said, both the Armani bronzer and the YSL bronzer, they both have talc in the ingredient list. So a question is whether or not that should be a deterrent in terms of whether or not people want to buy those products. And I think that the main issue with talc in cosmetics is that it could be contaminated with asbestos, and so therefore you don't want to be breathing it in, especially because even though you probably don't really want to have asbestos on your skin either, if you breathe it in, then that could be problematic. And I think that when we're talking about people who have gotten sick from exposure to asbestos, it more is that they make a big cloud of powder in their bathroom with Johnson's baby powder, and then they breathe that in, and they do it every day for a period of years, and so they're actually inhaling a fair amount of asbestos. I don't think that there's been any fallout from either of those bronzers, either the Armani one or the YSL one, and I haven't noticed any fallout at all, so even if it were contaminated with asbestos, I don't think that that would be something that would be so concerning to me, and both of those have seemed fine on my skin and not irritating, so I am not unwilling to use those products, even though all things being equal, I think that having a bronzer that performs equally well but that doesn't have the talc in it, that would probably be better. And then if you can have a bronzer like the RMS ones, or actually the Haus Labs ones, that perform much better and that don't have talc in them, that seems to be even better yet. And now let's move on to the Armani bronzers. And so these are in cases that look very Asian to me, and I think they're actually quite attractive. And it kind of reminds me of spending time in Japan and Taiwan and other Asian countries that I have really enjoyed. So that's a little bit reminiscent for me. And I think it's interesting that these are 2 different shades, and they actually put different colors on the top of them so that you could tell them apart. So if you were like a makeup artist, then you could pick out the one that you wanted without having to open it. So I think that's nice. So another thing that I noticed when I got this is that this is just an enormous product. So compared to either the RMS product or the YSL product, you get 3 times as much product in this as you do in those products, and the container is also much larger. So this is making me think about the highlighter that I recently bought from Chanel, which is actually really gorgeous, but it also is really enormous. And I think that in this case, I think it could be the case that some people may be using a lot of bronzer on a daily basis, and that there's the potential for people to actually use up a whole bronzer like this. I think with the case of that Chanel highlighter, I really like that highlighter, but I don't think that very many people are going to use up that whole highlighter because it is just as big as this one. So I think that it's not necessarily bad that this is really large, but it definitely is something that you might not be, for instance, taking along in your purse because it does take up a lot of space. But therefore, even though it's fairly expensive in terms of the price of the product, if you're talking about price per gram, it's a much better deal than either of these other bronzers. Now, another thing that I see when I look at the label for this product is that even though on the Nordstrom site that it says that this is made in France, it actually says right on the label that it is made in China, and then it says Luxury Products LLC. So that is not necessarily a problem for me. I am aware that there's a lot of companies in China that are not very well regulated and that they might be creating products that actually don't have the ingredients in them that they say that they are. But I think it probably is the case that there are also very legitimate companies that can be trusted in China, and that if you know who you're dealing with, that they probably are creating very good products. And it would be my hope that Armani would be dealing with those companies, but it definitely is going to raise a lot of questions in a lot of people's minds. And the fact that Nordstrom is saying that they're made in France, and that even though somebody made a comment in their review about that, that still says that they're made in France on the Nordstrom website, that's a little bit on the misleading side. Now, another thing on the Nordstrom site, it says that this product is an ultra creamy bronzing powder infused with curing oils. Now, I'm not sure what a curing oil is. This one does have one synthetic conditioning ingredient in it, but that is not an oil. And I don't think that the texture of this product is creamy at all. I don't think that the YSL one is creamy, but I think that if anything, that these are less creamy than the YSL ones. And that they certainly are a very finely milled product. I feel like they are going on really nicely and disappearing into my skin. So I'm not saying that they're not a quality product or that I can't make them work. I think that they're working very nicely. But they certainly don't have the creaminess that, for instance, the House Labs product or the RMS product has. One of the ingredients in this is dimethicone, and so this does have more silicone in it than some bronzers have. It does have a very slight shimmer in this one, and I feel like I can see the shimmer in it more than I can see the shimmer in the YSL one, but I don't think that that makes it inappropriate for me to use it all over my face. I think it's a very slight shimmer, and the shimmer particles are very tiny, and I think it just gives me sort of more of a glowy type of a look rather than a sweaty look or a fake look. Another thing that the Nordstrom website says is that it is formulated with micronized pigments that help to blur and smooth the appearance of texture, and the ultra creamy powder melts into skin seamlessly and stays in place for up to 24 hours. So again, I don't really feel like I'm trusting anything that the Nordstrom site is saying because they are so blatantly wrong about some of this. But I do think that this is a finely milled powder and that it is blending into my skin and that it is nice to use. So there are 4 shades that they are offering, and when they posted pictures of those 4 shades on an Instagram account called Trend Mood, which is followed by a lot of people that are in the makeup community, a lot of people are pretty mad about that because they said that none of the bronzer shades were dark enough for some people to be able to wear. And I do think it is the case from the pictures on the Nordstrom website that these are not really intended for people with dark skin, and that people that have skin that might be considered to be dark tan, I guess would be the description, that those would be appropriate. But if we're going darker than that, then I think that these are not going to work for people. So of the two shades that I have, this is the one that is number 90, and I don't know if you can see that in the pan, but I think that when I swatch it on my hand or put it on my face, I do think that this leans decidedly yellow, and actually more yellow than I feel comfortable with. So I think that for someone to use this, they would probably be best to have skin that's considerably more yellow than mine. It could be the same skin tone in terms of the darkness, but I feel like if your skin is leaning more pink than mine, or if it's more on this neutral or peachy type color, that this might turn out to be a bit too yellow. And then this one is shade 100. And I feel like this one is very close to both the House Labs in the Light Level 3 and also to the YSL in shade number 2. And so I feel like I should be able to get some use out of all of three of these, and that I can use them fairly interchangeably, just lightly all over my face to give my face a little bit more color. And then if we look at shade number 110 in terms of the pictures on the Nordstrom website, I would say that that one looks very golden. It's leaning quite golden, I would think. And then 120 looks like it's appropriate for people that have somewhat darker skins, and it's leaning fairly reddish. So it seems to be the case that this is really not going to be available in the US at all, except through the Nordstrom website. And that it's not even on the Armani website, and I'm not sure it's going to be. And it supposedly is available in Europe, but I'm not sure how widely available it is there. If I were going to take a guess, it would be that this is not really designed either for Europe or for the US, and then instead it's designed for the Asian market. So the reason that I think this is certainly because of this packaging. I think that this is something that seems very Asian to me based on my having spent time in Asia, and on these colors. So I think that the shades that they're offering, if you're offering them to either Europe or the US, these would not be the shades that I would pick. But if you're thinking about South Asia or East Asia, Japan, Taiwan, places like that, I think these would be exactly the colors that you would want to be offering. And so I would guess that that's what this particular line is for, and that we can use it here if you want to buy it from Nordstrom. But that's also why the website for Nordstrom is not giving you very accurate information, because they're not really even trying to promote it in the US. And Nordstrom wanted to sell it through their website, so apparently they were allowed to do that, but it's not really designed for the US, I don't think. And in general, I'm not a big fan of the Armani products that I've used so far, except for their lipsticks. Their lipsticks have been really, really terrific, and I couldn't be more impressed with those lipsticks, actually. I think that their blush has been okay. I think that most of their product releases have not been ones that I can use at all because of the ingredients they're using, and they haven't necessarily performed well when I have found ones that I have been willing to try. And I think that these bronzers are not too bad. I think that the one that I purchased, I think I should be able to get some use out of. It certainly seems to be functionally fine, and I think that I actually kind of like this packaging more than I like the YSL packaging personally. And so I don't think this is a mistake, but I do think you have to be really careful about not choosing the wrong color, because at least that 91, that does lean very, very yellow. So what I did today is that I actually used all three of these bronzers. So I started off by taking the lightest shade in the YSL one, and I put that all over my face just to show you what that would look like on my face. And then I put on a little bit more strategically the Armani bronzer that is in the shade 100. And then at the end, then I put on some of the RMS bronzer on the top of that, using that more as like a blush and a highlighter. And then over the top of that, I put on a tiny bit of that shade that is called Bohemian Girl, that is peach color. And I think that this kind of layering of the bronzers that I have actually turned out to have a fairly pretty and realistic, but also kind of a sophisticated and summery look. And I don't have any tan at all on my skin, and yet I think it looks quite summery and pretty. So I feel like the idea that if you have multiple bronzers in your collection, that layering them so that you can use them together, that might give you a much more natural look than if you just stick to one of them. So thank you very much for watching all the way to the end of the video, and please let me know which bronzers you have enjoyed, because I want to make sure that if I haven't picked them up yet, that I go ahead and do that before I get to my bronzer roundup. And also, if you haven't subscribed yet to the channel, then I hope you will go ahead and do that. And Coco and I love you very much, so thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.